The soldiers cut off the head of Pertinax, and fastened it on a spear, glorying in the deed. Thus did Pertinax, who undertook to restore everything in a moment, come to his end. He failed to comprehend, though a man of wide practical experience, that one cannot with safety reform everything at once, and that the restoration of a state, in particular, requires both time and wisdom. He had lived 67 years, lacking 4 months and 3 days, and had reigned 87 days. When the fate of Pertinax was noised about, some ran to their homes, and others to those of the soldiers, all taking thought for their own safety. But Sulpicianus, who had been sent by Pertinax to the camp to set matters in order there, remained on the spot, and intrigued to get himself appointed emperor. Meanwhile, Didius Julianus, at once an insatiate money-getter and a wanton spendthrift, who was always eager for revolution, and hence had been exiled by Commodus to his native city of Mediolanum, now, when he heard of the death of Pertinax, hastily made his way to the camp, and standing at the gates of the enclosure, made bids to the soldiers for the rule over the Romans. Then ensued a most disgraceful business, and one unworthy of Rome. For just as if it had been in some market or auction room, both the city and its entire empire were auctioned off. The sellers were the ones who had slain the emperor, and the would-be buyers were Sulpicianus and Julianus, who vied to outbid each other, one from the inside, the other from the outside. They gradually raised their bids up to 20,000 sesterces per soldier. Some of the soldiers would carry word to Julianus. "Sulpicianus offers so much. How much more do you make it?" And to Sulpicianus in return, "Julianus promises so much. How much do you raise him?" Sulpicianus would have one day, being inside and being prefect of the city, and also the first to name the figure 20,000, had not Julianus raised his bid no longer by a small amount, but by 5,000 at one time, both shouting in a loud voice and also indicating the amount with his fingers. So the soldiers, captivated by the successive bid, and at the same time fearing that Sulpicianus might avenge Pertinax, an idea that Julianus put into their heads, received Julianus inside and declared him emperor. So, toward evening, the new ruler hastened to the forum in the Senate house. He was escorted by a vast number of praetorians with numerous standards, as if prepared for action, his object being to intimidate both us and the populace at the outset, and thereby to secure our allegiance. And the soldiers were calling him Commodus, and extolling him in various other ways. As for us senators, when the news was brought to each of us individually, and we ascertained the truth, we were possessed by fear of Julianus and the soldiers, especially all of us who had done any favors for Pertinax, or anything to displease Julianus. I was one of these, for I had received various honors from Pertinax, including the praetorship, and when acting as an advocate for others at trial, I had frequently proved Julianus to be guilty of many offenses. Nevertheless, we made our appearance, partly for this very reason, since it did not seem to us to be safe to remain at home, for fear such a course might in itself arouse suspicion. So when bath and dinner were over, we pushed our way through the soldiers, entered the Senate house, and heard him deliver a speech that was quite worthy of him, in the course of which he said, "I see that you need a ruler, and I myself am best fitted of any to rule you. I should mention all the advantages I can offer, if you were not already familiar with them and had not already had experience of me. Consequently, I have not even asked to be attended here by many soldiers, but have come to you alone in order that you may ratify what has been given to me by them." "I am here alone," is what he said, though he had actually surrounded the entire Senate house outside with heavy armed troops and had a large number of soldiers in the chamber itself. Moreover, he reminded us of our knowledge of the kind of man he was, in consequence of which we both feared and hated him. Having thus secured confirmation of the imperial power by decrees of the Senate also, he proceeded up to the palace, and finding the dinner that had been prepared for Pertinax, he made great fun of it, and sending out to every place which by any means whatever something expensive could be procured at the same time of the night, he proceeded to gorge himself while the corpse was still lying in the building, and then to play at dice. Among others that he took along with him was Pylades the pantomime, The next day, we went up to pay our respects to him, molding our faces, so to speak, and posturing, so that our grief should not be detected. The populace, however, went about openly with sullen looks, spoke its mind as much as it pleased, and was getting ready to do anything it could. Finally, when he came to the Senate House and was about to sacrifice to Janus before the entrance, all fell to shouting, as if by preconcerted arrangement, calling him the stealer of the empire and parricide. Then, when he affected not to be angry and promised them some money, they became indignant at the implication that they could be bribed, and all cried out together, "We don't want it, we won't take it." The surrounding buildings echoed back their shout in a way to make one shudder. When Julianus heard their reply, he could endure it no longer, but ordered those standing nearest to be slain. That exasperated the populace all the more, and it did not cease expressing its regret for Pertinax and abusing Julianus, invoking the gods and cursing the soldiers. But though many were wounded and killed in many parts of the city, they continued to resist. Finally, they seized arms and rushed together into the circus, and there spent the night and the following day without food or drink, shouting and calling upon the remainder of the soldiers, especially Pescennius Niger and his followers in Syria, to come to their aid. Later, exhausted by their shouting, by their fasting, and by their loss of sleep, they separated and kept quiet, awaiting the hopes for deliverance from abroad. After seizing power in this manner, Julianus managed affairs in a servile fashion, paying court to the Senate as well as to all the men of any influence. Now he would make promises, now bestow favors, and he laughed and jested with anybody and everybody. He was constantly resorting to the theaters, and kept getting up banquets. In fine, he left nothing undone to court our favor. Yet he did not only play the part well, but incurred suspicion as indulging in servile flattery. For every act that goes beyond propriety, even though it seems to be gracious, is regarded by men of sense as trickery. When the Senate voted him a statue of gold, he declined to accept it, saying, "Give me a bronze one, so that it may last, for I observe that gold and silver statues of the emperors that ruled before me have been destroyed, whereas the bronze ones remain." In this he was mistaken, for it is virtue that preserves the memory of rulers, and in fact the bronze statue that was granted him was destroyed after his own overthrow. These were the occurrences in Rome. I shall now speak of what happened outside and of the various rebellions. For 3 men at this time, each commanding 3 legions of citizens, and many foreigners besides, attempted to secure the control of affairs: Severus, Niger, and Albinus. The last named was governor of Britain, Severus of Pannonia, and Niger of Syria. These, then, were the 3 men portended by the 3 stars that suddenly came to view surrounding the sun when Julianus, in our presence, was offering the sacrifices of entrance in front of the Senate House. These stars were so very distinct that the soldiers kept continually looking at them, and pointing them out to one another, while declaring that some dreadful fate would befall the emperor. As for us, however, much we hoped and prayed that it might so prove, yet the fear of the moment would not permit us to gaze up at them except by furtive glances. So much for this incident, which I give from my own knowledge. Now, of the 3 leaders that I mentioned, Severus was the shrewdest. He understood in advance that after Julianus had been deposed, the 3 would clash and fight against one another for the empire, and he therefore determined to win over the rival who was nearest to him. So he sent a letter by one of his trusted friends to Albinus, appointing him Caesar. As for Niger, who was proud of having been summoned by the populace, he had no hopes of him. Albinus, accordingly, in the belief that he was to share the rule with Severus, remained where he was, and Severus, after winning over everything in Europe except Byzantium, was hastening against Rome. He did not venture outside the protection of arms, but having selected his 600 most valiant men, he passed day and night in their midst. These did not at once put off their breastplates until they were in Rome. Julianus, on learning this, caused the Senate to declare Severus a public enemy, and proceeded to prepare against him. In the suburbs, he constructed a rampart provided with gates, so that he might take up a position out there and fight from that base. The city during these days became nothing more nor less than a camp, in the enemy's country as it were. Great was the turmoil on the part of the various forces that were encamped and drilling, men, horses, elephants. And great also was the fear inspired in the rest of the population by the armed troops, because the latter hated them. Yet, at times we could be overcome by laughter, for the Praetorians did nothing worthy of their name and of their promise, for they had learned to live delicately. The sailors summoned from the fleet stationed at Misenum did not even know how to drill, and the elephants found their towers burdensome, and would not even carry their drivers any longer, but then threw them off. But what caused us the greatest amusement was his fortifying of the palace with latticed gates and strong doors, for inasmuch as it seemed probable that the soldiers would never have slain Pertinax so easily if the doors had been securely locked, Julianus believed that in the case of defeat he would be able to shut himself up there and survive. He accordingly put to death both Laetus and Marcia, so that all who conspired against Commodus perished. For later Severus gave Narcissus to the wild beasts, causing it to be expressly proclaimed that he was the man who had strangled Commodus. Julianus also killed many boys as a magic rite, believing that he could avert some future misfortunes if he learned of them beforehand. And he kept sending men against Severus to slay him by treachery. But Severus presently reached Italy, and took possession of Ravenna without striking a blow. Moreover, the men whom Julianus kept sending against him, either to persuade him to turn back or to block his advance, were going over to Severus' side, and the Praetorians, in whom Julianus reposed most confidence, were becoming worn out by their constant toil and were becoming greatly alarmed at the report of Severus' near approach. At this juncture, Julianus called us together and bade us appoint Severus to share his throne. But the soldiers, convinced by letters of Severus that if they surrendered the slayers of Pertinax and themselves kept the peace, they would suffer no harm, arrested the men who had killed Pertinax and announced this fact to Silius Messala, who was then consul. The latter assembled us in the Athenaeum, so named from the educational activities that were carried on in it, and informed us of the soldiers' action. We thereupon sentenced Julianus to death, named Severus emperor, and bestowed divine honors on Pertinax. And so it came about that Julianus was slain, as he was reclining in the palace itself. His only words were, "But what evil have I done? Whom have I killed?" He had lived 60 years, 4 months, and the same number of days, out of which he had reigned 66 days.